But all our lives have been affected by war, and the ones I can specifically trace are the wars between England and France during the 1700s that put the King of England in debt to the father of William Penn, and a debt that couldn't be repaid except by the granting of ownership of land in Pennsylvania. That subsequent events led to the development of that region. Eventually, because of the Revolutionary War in France, led to the settlement of my ancestors in Pennsylvania. So it's a convoluted trail, and the unintended consequences of every action can lead to massive changes in the world's economy, and a prime example of that right now is the battle in Ukraine between Russia and is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the subsequent economic and world impact that it's having. And of course, it's not over at this point, and opportunity for massive increase in its scope. In fact, that's been prophesied by a number of saints. Don't be surprised if France and Germany and Italy are devastated by Russian advances in the near future. But I want to just describe now the wars during my lifetime, the impact on the direction that my life went. I was fortunate in the blessing I received in not having to participate directly in conflicts during my extended lifetime. Ever since I was a very small child, though, the effects of war and rumors of war and actual war have been always hovering in the distance. The first inclination I had of war was from Father Carrick during a homily that he gave one Sunday, probably in 1937. He talked about the European situation and things that were going on there, and I wasn't really aware of war, imminence of war there. But after he was done talking and mentioning the fact that the war was coming and we'd better be prepared for it, and it was going to be a terrible war because so many countries were already preparing, and there had been so much animosity and turmoil in Europe that it was bound to be worse than the last one. So that struck me very forcefully. And that night I remember dreaming about it, house burning down and all this. So it stayed with me for quite a while, but it was the first precursor of what really did happen. I remember a personal experience I had with a victim of war. One time we were over visiting my grandparents in Phillipsburg, and Mom's stepbrother came over to visit us. His voice was so unique that it struck you immediately, and it made you wonder why he had such a voice. And I remember being, as a little child, my dad talking to him during a conversation that included an answer to that question. During the 1918 advance in the Argonne, the Germans used gas, and he had been severely gassed, and it affected his lungs and his throat when he breathed in the chlorine fumes. By the time I heard him, 15 years had already passed since his injury, and yet he could barely speak above a whisper, and the tone of his voice was unique. As far as I know, he never recovered from that injury. And then, of course, there were some older guys around there, a couple that I recall, that were veterans of the Civil War. Although they didn't talk about it very much, it still was a fact that everyone knew they were veterans. Although I didn't really know about this ancestor during my childhood, he certainly had an effect on my mother's side of the family. This is a picture of my great-grandfather with his Civil War uniform. He was a sniper for the North, and his story is pretty interesting. I had a second cousin who fought in the Philippines around 1900. He was in the Army. I have a picture of him in his uniform, as you can see here. Of course, World War I had only been over a little more than 10 years before my birth, and my father was a veteran from World War I, and his brother was a veteran and died subsequently from the flu as a result of the war, and a second cousin who had fought in France. Dad and I were together one day in Clearfield, and we were at the bus station where my second cousin was boarding the bus along with some other World War II veterans who were going to France to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the armistice on November 11th, 1918. And I know my dad wanted to go, but it was an expensive trip, and Dad was not very well employed. My cousin was a teller at the bank there in Clearfield and had worked all during the Depression, so he could financially afford it. So they went back to France and had a big reunion. Ironically, just months before World War II started. Russia has a long, long history of brutality and oppression from their czars and their rulers. And during World War I, the army of the Russians was so badly managed that the Germans managed to succeed in winning the war against them. And so even before the time of the collapse of the Germans, Russia had collapsed and surrendered. This led to much discontent and an opportunity for Bolshevism to rise. And the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and a whole bunch of other ones, took over the government. And they started out as a democracy, but it didn't last long, and it was soon overturned, and the left-wingers came in, to Trotsky and Lenin and so forth, as I mentioned. So the resulting turmoil in Russia led to millions of lives being lost. The Ukrainians lost millions through starvation from the collective farm system that Stalin implanted in the late 20s. And as a result, famine in Russia and the turmoil was in the news periodically. In fact, our former president, Hoover, had gone to Russia and done some great humanitarian work before he was elected president. So Russia was a hovering giant, crippled but very dangerous. Philosophy has spread over the world today, and we're suffering right now in this country and the whole world from the communistic influence. So during the Depression years, starvation and deaths in Russia, and Stalin's desire for power led to their meddling in Europe, and the concern of Europe that they would be able to take over and impose communism on those countries was always a factor in every decision made during those years. But the newspapers were also full of war news. The earliest I remember was about the Japanese in Manchuria. The Japanese attacked Manchuria in 1931, and they were there until the end of the war in 1945. And I remember the tales of the horrors the Japanese inflicted on the Chinese population. This photo shows the moment of death for this hapless Chinese captive that the Japanese officer has decapitated. If you look carefully, you can see the shadow of the blade just below the neck of the dead man. The Japanese were extremely brutal and barbarous in just about every way possible, including chemical and biological weapons, bayonet practice on live human beings tied to posts, and the rape of Nanking. These were all articles in the newspapers that were periodically published. Then in 1936, layered on top of all this other stuff, The Italians attacked Ethiopia, and Mussolini was trying to capture, for some reason, Ethiopia. He was a egomaniac with a long-standing case of syphilis that was affecting his brain. They started that war against a helpless people whose soldiers didn't even have shoes. Believe it or not, I remember this photograph from the newspapers back in the 30s. And when I was recounting this part of my life, I wondered if that photograph was still available. And I did find it on the internet, and this is it right here. They perpetrated a number of widespread massacres, butchering children and whatever, wiping out whole villages without regard to sex or age of the victims. But by the early 40s, the Italians made so many blunders, and they let the Ethiopians beat them. So they signed an armistice in 1941 and tucked their tail between their legs and went home. But not after they caused an incalculable amount of misery for those poor people. Then, of course, coincidental with that was the rise of Hitler in Germany, and there was a constant concern about him, although nobody was doing anything about any of it. Everyone knew that Hitler was preparing for war, and they were scared to death. World War I had ended merely 18 years before this event, and it was obvious where this was going, and the worst fears of the world came to pass because they were afraid to step in and stop him in the nascent part of his rise to power. This is a clip from a newsreel taken by a British organization called Pathé during the Nuremberg rallies of 1936. And this film exhibits the terrifying demonic power that Adolf Hitler had over people, his people and the world.
In German medieval Nuremberg, the marching, seething squash of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Congress comes to an end. This year they say there are 800,000 pairs of boots standing heel to heel, waiting for the Führer's final speech. And the high spot comes when, after a detailed review of Nazi achievements, Hitler cries, "My life's fight has not been in vain."
Indem ich euch ihre Blicke weise ich, mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft. Sein Sowjetzeichen soll er vor sich hertragen, und wir werden in unseren Zeichen wieder siegen.
Then, in addition to all these wars, the Spanish Civil War began in 1936. Because the church was on the royalist side and meddled with the politics of the day, they suffered grievously from the uprising and the anger of the people and the support of the communists of the people. Many religious people were slaughtered. The Germans gave the royalists guns and ammunition and flew bombing raids and destroyed some cities there in Spain. And the communists helped the revolutionaries with many guns and so forth. So those two sides led to the terrible slaughter. That ended just before Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. Then in 1938, Hitler made his first move against the Sudetenland and the Rhineland and annexed them. And he annexed Austria without any serious implications for the rest of the world. But the Poles and the French and the British had signed an alliance that they would go to war if Germany attacked Poland. And on September 1st, 1939, Hitler did that. And it didn't take him long to crush Poland, because Poland was not armed with modern weapons. They were still using thousands of horsemen to battle against tanks. And of course they got wiped out. I have a story I'd like to interject here. One time I was in New York, and this was after I began to travel a fair amount. I was in New York City for some business, and I was ready to leave the hotel and go to the airport. So I went out on the street in front of the hotel. There were a number of cabs lined up in front of the hotel. I could see, though, that the person that was taking care of assigning cabs to the guests had already assigned quite a few, and they were waiting, I guess, for some additional guests or something. Anyway, they weren't available to me. So about 3 or 4 cabs down the sidewalk was one available. So I walked over to the cab, and I had a suitcase, and the cab driver got out. You're going to put the suitcase in the trunk. And I was standing there, and the cab driver just picked up my suitcase, and this couple came out of the hotel. And I could tell that this gal was pretty frisky, and the guy was, well, I don't think they were up any good, let's put it that way. They came rushing up to where my cab was, and this woman got in the cab, and the guy crawling in behind her, and the cab driver started to say something, and the guy pulled out a bill and gave it to the cab driver, and of course that ended my career with that cab driver. And so I walked on down the street. There was another cab just pulled up, so the cabbie just made me a signal to come on, so I went on down and got in the cab. So we left the hotel area there, and we're driving along, and this cab driver had a really strong accent. And, you know, he told me, he said, I know that God works in strange ways. My trip to the airport was a plum ride. It was a long ride and paid, a decent fare, whereas the cab that had been stolen from me was only going a few blocks, and the cabbie would lose his place in line. So we're driving along, and the cab driver was talking about how he was blessed to have me as a passenger to the airport, which was probably a $20 or $30 ride, and how he'd been blessed since he came to the United States. So I asked him where he was from, and he said he's from Poland. And I said, boy, how'd you fare during the war? He hesitated for a while, and he said, well, I said, I'll tell you. He said, I was an attorney in Warsaw in 1939, and I had a good practice. I'd been in practice for about 6 or 7 years, and I'd had a good series of clients, and I made a lot of money. And he said, I was doing very well and getting a reputation for being a good attorney. And he said, in September 1939, the Germans attacked Warsaw and started bombing, and he was married, and he had 2 little children. And he said they decided to try to get out into the country, and the traffic had been stopped, and the bombs had destroyed and blocked the streets and so forth. So they had a baby carriage. They put the baby in the carriage, and he carried the 3-year-old that he had. His wife pushed the carriage, and they were running along the street. And they came to a railroad overpass. The river went over the street. And as they got under it, a number of German soldiers caught up to them. The Germans grabbed the baby out of the carriage and took it by its heel and smashed its head on the sidewalk. And then they ripped the other one out of his arms and did the same thing to it. And then they shot his wife. And since he was a young man, they were looking for slave labor, so they put him in a factory, and he worked in a factory with the Germans during the war. During the time he was slave labor, he kept a record of the German officials that came there, so he would have a record of who was in charge of the slave labor and the number of people that died from starvation in that factory. The average life of a slave laborer in a factory was about 3 months, apparently. Well, they didn't provide any shelter or food for them, but they had to work night and day and every day of the week, and they just died from exhaustion or being murdered on the spot. But he kept these records, and after the war, he went to the American Army officers there and told them that he knew a lot of Germans and he could identify them. because these Germans at the end of the war then substituted their uniforms, civilian clothes, or tried to disguise themselves and escape punishment. So he worked with the Army intelligence, and he said, you can't imagine how many of those Germans got into the United States and are still living here in this country that should have been shot and hung but escaped punishment. This was probably in the, I would say, mid-60s that I encountered this fellow. But I've never forgotten his tale and the horror that he endured during those years at the hands of those totally evil people. Before Germany invaded Poland, Russia and Germany had signed a compact to split up Poland and the part of Eastern Europe between Russia and Germany. And of course, when the Germans attacked Poland and took it over, the Russians leaped into the eastern edge of Poland and met the Germans about halfway through, and they split up Poland then between the two of them. And for a little while they lived in relative peace together. And Hitler only signed that treaty in order to gain some more time to deal with England, and whom he hoped that would surrender, and to prepare this massive attack against Russia. And in spite of Stalin being warned ahead of time, on Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against Russia in a surprise attack. It was the largest army ever congregated in the history of the world. 3.8 million soldiers advanced against Russia all along the front from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea and the Crimea area. It was a front that was 1,800 miles long. This operation opened the Eastern Front, occupied a section of Poland and through the Ukraine and the other countries, Latvia and Lithuania and so forth. Some of the most horrific atrocities and crimes were committed by both sides. The Russians rapidly retreated, and the Germans captured some 5 million Russian soldiers in the subsequent operations that summer. It's unbelievable. And most of those men were starved to death because the Germans had no way to feed them or care for them, and they penned them up in large fenced areas in the middle of the Ukrainian flat country and left them starved to death. This picture shows a Russian conscript, a Ukrainian conscript actually. Ukraine was part of Russia in those days, kissing his wife and bidding his children goodbye. But the odds that they survive even were remote, because the war swayed back and forth across the Don River over the next 3 years, and very few civilians survived. They either were starved to death or murdered by the Germans. The German advance was stalled at Moscow at the same time that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 7, 1941. The Russians stopped German advance during that month, and it turned the tide from German aggression to one of German defense, because from there on through the entire war, more than 3 years more, the Germans were on the defensive rather than aggressive invaders. The Germans had expected a quick victory and not equipped their troops with winter clothing, and when they got into Russia and the defense was so much more powerful than they expected, and even with the horrendous losses of millions of soldiers, the Russians were able to recruit enough manpower from the Siberian areas to fight the Germans back during the winter, one of the worst winters in history, during the 1941-42 winter, and caught the Germans without adequate supplies and clothing, and the losses on the German side were horrendous from frostbite and, of course, the slaughter of the war itself. The invasion of Ukraine by the Germans led to formation of partisans behind the lines of the Germans, and during the war they inflicted terrible punishment on the Germans in the rear guard, rear stations, and through the transportation system and other means. They harassed the Germans endlessly and sapped the morale and the strength of the German army to a great extent. And of course, the Germans were unforgiving and extremely brutal people to start with, and any partisans that were caught were immediately executed. And this picture is a very dramatic scene of an execution of two young teenagers who were involved in the partisan activity and helped free some Russian prisoners of war. This is such a dramatic picture that it's really, if you study it closely, you can see that the hair on the young girl is flying upward from the sudden stop of the rope. That really was about the moment of her death. December 7th, 1941 was the initiation of our country into World War II. Up till the day before that, there wasn't a chance that President Roosevelt was going to declare war on Germany, because the pacifistic movement in this country, the political forces against joining any European conflict were so powerful, because the memories of World War II were still vivid in everyone's mind. But the attack on Pearl Harbor converted the morale or the desire for revenge against the Japanese and their sneak attack and the 2,300 soldiers and sailors that were killed that morning. I doubt if you could have found a dozen people in the whole country that were against joining Roosevelt in declaration of war. I remember December 7th, 1941 very clearly. Dad had been called to work that day, and so we didn't go to church. And during the returning volume of traffic from after Mass, one of the neighbors stopped and told us that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, and we were now probably going to go to war with the Japanese. And I remember my mother exclaiming in really alarm about the probable events that were coming. Of course, I was alarmed too, since I was 12 years old and impressionable, but I had my own ideas too, but still her alarm really transmitted itself to me too. So when Dad came home that evening, I was really anxious to tell him, because I didn't think he knew. And of course he knew almost immediately, because he had a telegraph key in his office, and that news flashed around the world almost at the same time it was happening. So he certainly was well aware of what was going on, but I waited for him, and when I heard his car coming down the road, I ran out to the garage to meet him and tell him, and he told me that he knew, but he didn't console me or anything. I guess he didn't realize how alarmed I was. Terrible suddenness of the attack at Pearl Harbor and the subsequent declaration of war on us by Germany, since Japan and Germany were allies, and amount of unpreparedness that we were in at that time, that everyone knew was true, led us to really have serious reservations about whether we were going to be able to win the war or not. And of course, 1942 then began with a whole series of terrible losses, especially on the transatlantic shipping to England. We had been shipping goods to England under a ruse called Lend-Lease, where we gave England supplies in return for some islands off the coast of the United States. But that was a ruse to help England in their dire straits before we were involved with the war. And the pacifistic attitude of our citizenship prevented any more than that. And in fact, Roosevelt was lucky to get away with the Lend-Lease ruse. But of course, after the cowardly and unexpected strike at Pearl Harbor that sank a whole number of our battleships and killed so many people, really incited the patriotism of our country. But that couldn't conceal the terrible unpreparedness that we were in. 1942 was a terrible year for shipping. As I mentioned, we lost over 400 merchant ships that year that were torpedoed by German submarines. in their crossing of the Atlantic. And 1943 started out the same way, but we developed techniques to counterattack the submarines, and we were able to control the losses to a degree that didn't stop us from resupplying and doing the things that had to be done to help England survive until we could go over and put an end to it, beginning on D-Day in June 4th, 1944. But anyway, as the years passed, as for 1942 passed and 1943, we resurged or recharged our armament in a way that's nothing short of miraculous. Practically every factory in the United States converted over to war goods, and we produced incalculable amounts of war production outputs. So our confidence then began to arise as the Pacific War turned against the Japanese, and they began their retreat too, although they fought to the death, and they were a terrible enemy, as we learned at Okinawa and Iwo Jima and so many other places. But it was a time of great stress for all of us, even me as just a very young teenager. I knew the consequences of what would happen if we did lose, and I followed the war news very carefully every day. I watched as our armies and navies and Air Force began to pulverize Europe, even though at great cost. We began to turn the tide. There's so much literature written about the war that I'm not going to try to detail it in any great amount, but from a personal standpoint, it was a time of great events, and it turned out to be the pivotal change in the whole way that our civilization lived, especially in our country. Women became emancipated from the house and freely worked in the factories and so forth that they wouldn't have done 5 years before that. The mixturing of our population in the services greatly broke down the barriers in the regional parochialism that existed before the war. In other words, for example, a Texan in New York would not have been welcomed because he was from Texas, and of course the Texans despised the East Coast, so it was a mutual affair. But the fact that men from Texas and men from California and New York and everywhere served side by side through a very trying and terrible time exposed the similarity and the commonality of our population. The war ended in 1945, but the disruption of industry by the war and the conversion of industry to produce war goods had disrupted any commercial products from being produced. And all the tooling that was used to make these products, such as toasters and automobiles and whatever, had been cosmolined and put in storage during the war because they weren't permitted to make them, and anyway, even if they had been able to, because of the allocation of raw materials to the war effort. So the insides of the factories had been disrupted and rearranged to produce whatever the government required them to produce. And then in order to reestablish the commercial and domestic production, that all had to be reversed, and the tools had been put in cosmoline during the war had to be brought out of storage and cleaned and probably done some maintenance on, and the tooling and the presses and everything had to be reinstalled, and it was a mammoth job. And of course the demand for skilled workers to do all that was at a premium. And so I came onto the scene then in 1947, although I benefited during my high school years by having work at the brickyard and 2 years on the Great Lakes as a seaman during the summer. But when I graduated from high school, there were endless amounts of jobs available, and that's how I got on at GE in June 1947. They hired me without hardly testing whether I was still breathing or not. But in any case, the boom that started at the end of the war still is not dissipated decades and decades later. And I was blessed by being born, and when I was too young to participate in the war, in World War II, or suffer from the Depression, because I knew we were poor, but everybody else was too, so it wasn't a hardship for me at all, in the sense that I was aware of it. And then, of course, after the World War II, Korea came began in 1950, in June of 1950, and I was married then, or about to be married in August of 1950, and so I never got called up, and I didn't volunteer for that one either. I didn't want to go, of course, after I got married, and then all the subsequent wars, I was too old. So anyway, I was born at a very fortuitous time that I was able to benefit from all the sufferings and cruelty and millions of people being slaughtered during the wartime periods, that I didn't have to make a contribution to that, or nobody ever shot at me because of those incidences. So, I mean, I was totally unconscious and nothing planned, and just as I was born in the right year. But in any case, the war really changed the mentality and the social structure of our country and the world, actually. But the United States led the changes. We were the dominant country in 1945 after the victory. Our allies had suffered substantial damage from the war, but we hadn't suffered any damage to our country. And our factories had been modernized and were in full bore, so our economy was booming, and we assisted the rest of the world in reconstruction by our contributions to Lend-Lease and just Marshall Plan and all kinds of plans and contributions to the world to help them reconstruct their infrastructure and become viable and independently economically. We were extremely generous with the rest of the world. Even our enemies benefited equally. So that was all part of our economy and part of the labor required in our country to do all of that. And so the influx of young men, into the colleges after the war was enormous. Millions of men took advantage of the $40 a month in free education that was being offered to them by the government. And this tapped a tremendous resource of brain power that had been unable to do more than dig ditches and cut paperwood pre-war era. And of course, many brilliant people who went to college and got advanced degrees that would not have done so. And they contributed then to the advancement of science and medicine, and every phase of life. Their ingenious inventions and continuing inventions. And Tesla and Elon Musk is a great example of the outstanding genius that has been developing since the advent of World War II. When you think about it, I don't think people today are any smarter or have any more intelligence than they had 1,000 years ago, or 2,000, or 3,000, 10,000. It's a matter of developing that intelligence and building on the inventions of others. And no invention really is 100% unique. There's always a contribution from pieces and parts of other inventors that some new inventor finds a unique way to put together and make a new advance or a new step. And his stuff is eventually torn apart, and pieces of his inventions are, it's an exponential thing. And so the fact that electricity and the basic steam engines and so forth weren't invented until roughly 200 years ago now, and that's a drop in time when compared to all the vast eons of time that have gone on. And I read somewhere where the life of an invention in 1900 was 40 years or some such number, and by 1960 or 70 it was down into hours, which indicates simply that the turnover of an invention today is probably in the nanoseconds, because the propagation of the minds of so many geniuses and the tools they've been given by their forefathers in electronics and microscopes and, well, there's no end to that list, enable them to use those tools, which were brand new inventions in their youth probably, to advance and invent new things. And so it's an endless contribution, and it's exponentially expanding every day. And the trigger for this was World War II, in my opinion. I've read a lot about it. I've read thousands of books, particularly history. History is my favorite subject, and I'm not a history expert by any means, but I am aware of the worldwide situation today in 2023, the profound corruption and the so many layers of sexual perversion, with abortion being the foundation, but the endless perversion against children and satanic rituals and prostitution and pornography, and just an endless stream of corruption in government, the Department of Justice, the President, our Pope, the cardinals, the corruption in the Vatican Bank, and the homosexuality, the transgenderism. It seems that every organization in every country is pro anti-Christian. The demonic activities in every corner of the world are readily obvious to even the casual observer, and I think by far the universal sense is that it can't go on. The corruption is too profound, and it affects every level of government and society, and even your neighbors. The volume of perversion that's going on means that your neighborhood must contain a pervert of some sort. Certainly contains fornicators and adulterers, but those kind of pale in consequence compared to the perversion against children of all ages and abortion. If you read the lives of the saints dating back 150 years and more, you'll find a steady theme of warnings. And some of the highlights, of course, are Fatima and Akita and Garabandal and Enoch and so many others that are approved apparitions and have been seen by, in the case of Fatima, by at least 70,000 people at one time, and a good percentage of those were spectators that were anti-Christian or communistic and so forth, but they had to report to the newspapers which printed those facts and the event in 1917. And in any case, it appears that we're on the cusp of a major war and famine and disruption. And many are predicting that very serious events are in process. And at this date, and one of the key indicators that this is all true is the visit by the Pope to Moscow. And if that happens, then the prediction is that war will break out over Europe, and the timeline has already been predicted. And so we need to make sure that we're personally ready to meet our fate and our Maker. Well, I think that's enough preaching on this video, so we'll go to the next one now.